Today we're going to replace a cracked LCD display panel in a Hewlett-Packard x360 convertible laptop, model number 11-P112NR. The very first thing we're going to check is to make sure the digitizer is still functional. Just because the LCD is broken doesn't necessarily mean the digitizer needs replacing. The easiest way to determine this is connect an external monitor, and by default Windows should automatically clone both screens. Then you can touch the broken LCD, and if you're able to scroll, viewing it on the external monitor, then you know the digitizer is fine. Now, one of the handy things about this particular model is you don't have to take the digitizer off to get to the LCD. You work from the back side of the screen. Now, one thing you might find a little unusual is that most tutorials are going to tell you to remove the battery prior to working on it. However, in this case, because of the design of this machine, in order to remove the battery, you would have to remove about 19 screws, taking the entire bottom side apart, which is completely unnecessary on this machine because you're accessing the LCD from the rear side of the screen. So instead, what I'm going to tell you to do is do a full power down. Now, make sure you're not just putting it in sleep mode. Make sure you're doing an actual shutdown, because as you open and close the screen, it will end up turning itself back on if you don't do a full power down. And it's perfectly safe because all we're messing with is the LCD panel. You're going to want to locate the two little square black screw covers located down toward the bottom of the hinge on the screen side. Once you remove those very carefully, you'll want to set those aside so you don't lose them. And that will expose two Phillips head screws. You're going to want to use a number 0 Phillips head screwdriver to remove those two screws. Once those two screws are removed, you want to take a flathead screwdriver or very carefully use a knife. Don't use a razor knife. So once you get one of the corners popped off a little bit, you can hold a credit card, a guitar pick, or just use your fingernail as you work the screwdriver down. And each time you hear that little click sound, you've released another one of the tabs. You're going to want to be tempted to just pull the whole thing off. And you don't want to do that because you'll end up breaking some of those tabs. So you want to work your way all the way around. And as you can see, the entire back panel comes off. Now you can set this back panel aside, and you can see that the LCD panel is right there, very accessible. So first you need to remove all of these little black screws. You're going to want to remove these two silver screws on each of the two hinges that attach the hinges to the framework that holds the LCD in place. You'll want to take notice that these 4 screws are slightly different in size than the 2 you removed from the front bezel, so you do not want to mix those up. So set those 4 screws aside, and now we can move on to these black screws with the big wide flat head on them. Now, the 2 toward the bottom are just a little bit thicker than the rest of them. So make sure to set those 2 aside because it's very difficult to tell them apart. You're almost going to need to get a magnifying glass out to be able to tell the difference between those 2 bottom black screws and the remaining black screws. The next thing you're going to want to do is disconnect this cable here. Now this is of course the video cable that connects the monitor to the computer. And you take this tape, lift it up, and then very gently pull it out of place. And set that off to the side. From there, there's just some sticky tape holding that LCD panel in place. And if you pull it up very gently, the whole panel will come out with those 2 side brackets. Once you have this display removed, note that there are 4 screws holding these brackets to the panel. You're going to want to remove those and attach those to the new LCD panel. Okay, you're going to notice that there are 4 screws and there are 8 holes. Now, depending on how you have it oriented, those 4 screws are all going to go into the lower of the 2 for each corner. So just make sure to take note of that. Now that we're just about ready to put the screen into the computer, you want to peel the protective film off the LCD panel. You'll notice a little red tab so that you can grab it and peel it off. Once you've done so, be very, very careful not to touch the LCD screen. Being that it's going to be behind the digitizer, if you get any fingerprints on there, you'll never be able to get them off. So try not to touch the LCD panel. Now very carefully slide it back into place right where the old one was. You may have to pull some wires out of the way while you're doing so. Just make sure that it gets seated in there properly. Once you have it lined up with all the screw holes and the little plastic aligners, the next thing you're going to want to do is put in these two top screws. After that, pushing down the two hinges on either side, you're going to want to put those silver screws back in. And then work your way around and replace each of the black screws that we removed earlier. Now we're going to reconnect the video display cable. If you attempt to use any tools, you run the risk of puncturing one of the many very small copper leads on that cable, and that will cause you further display problems. So once connected, you pull the tape up and just gently lay the tape back down where it was. Once you see that everything is in place, very carefully line up the back cover and just very slowly snap. As you're snapping the display in place, you're going to work your way around, being careful that you're only pressing on the very outer 1/8 inch of the screen. You don't want to touch on the shiny part down here because you run the risk of cracking your newly replaced screen. So working just on the very outer edge of the bezel, you're going to snap all the way around and then give it a quick visual inspection and be sure that it's completely snapped and there are no wires sticking out. Before we put those two final screws back in, it's time for a double check. So we're going to press the power button here and watch it boot up. Okay, and now that we're logged in, don't freak out. That's actually my wallpaper. I sort of did that as a little joke. I'll pull the browser up here and you can see that everything is working normally. So now it's a simple matter of replacing those two front silver screws and then replacing the little black screw covers. And there you have it. Screen replacement for an HP X360 11-P 112NR convertible notebook.